If an apologist had any good arguments for God, they'd never waste their time and ours presenting bad ones, obviously. So when you hear a highly intelligent and highly educated apologist like William Lane Craig presenting circular arguments, straw man arguments, and other obvious fallacies, that tells you something. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book On Guard by William Lane Craig. In our last episode, Dr. Craig presented an argument that he borrowed from Gottfried Leibniz, the famous mathematician who died in the early 1700s. Written out as a syllogism, it goes like this. 1. Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. 2. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. 3. The universe exists. 4. Therefore, the universe has an explanation of its existence. And 5. Therefore, the explanation of the universe's existence is God. Dr. Craig then proceeded to try and defend premise 1 by committing a special pleading fallacy, proposing that the explanation for God could be that God exists because of a necessity of his own nature, while insisting that everything else can only be explained by some kind of external cause. Like we said last time, there's more than one way a premise can be defective besides just being false, and Dr. Craig has given us a good example of that here. By using the word explanation to mean one thing when talking about God and something different when talking about the universe, he's created an ambiguous premise, and ambiguous premises lead to an unreliable conclusion. Well, we covered premise 1 last time, so let's move on to premise 2. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, then that explanation is God. Now notice that premise 2 is an if-then statement. If you studied the laws of logic, you know that in order for an if-then statement to be true, the then part has to be implicit in the if part somehow, such that the if part cannot be true if the then part is false. For example, I might say, if my pet is a cat, then my pet is a mammal. All cats is mammals, so this is a true statement. The fact that it's a mammal is implicit in the fact that it's a cat. If my pet ain't a mammal, then it can't be a cat. Or I might say, if I'm wearing a hat, then it's raining outside. Now that'd be a false statement, because I can wear a hat whether or not it's raining. There's no implicit connection between wearing a hat and raining. In order for premise 2 to be a true statement, then, it must be the case that if the explanation of the existence of the universe is not God, then the universe cannot have any explanation. And like we saw last time, this is not the case. It's logically impossible for there to be a time when time did not exist, because that's a self-contradiction. And time is just one dimension of space-time, so if time exists, then space does too. An empty space contains energy, so if space exists, then so does energy. And matter is just an alternate form of energy. So as long as space-time exists, matter/energy exists as well. Which means that the universe exists as a necessity of its own nature, which is the same explanation Dr. Craig gives for God. So if he was being honest, he'd have to agree that it's possible for something other than God to be the explanation of the universe. God being the explanation of the universe ain't implicit in the universe having an explanation, and therefore premise 2 is false. And of course, there's lots of other possibilities as well. If we's going to appeal to undemonstrated invisible magical beings as the proposed explanation of the universe, then we can propose any number of other creation myths as being the explanation, and the result would be the same. There's no particular creation myth that's implicit in the idea that the universe has some kind of explanation, so we'd be committing a logical fallacy if we said that the existence of an explanation makes any one creation myth more likely than the others. And even without appealing to undemonstrated magical beings, it could still be the case that some other unknown, non-divine explanation could be the explanation of the universe. The universe would still have an explanation, but that explanation would not be God. So any way you slice it, premise 2 is obviously and egregiously false. Dr. Craig is an apologist, so it's going to be his job to make it sound true, even though it ain't. So let's see how he tackles this problem. Quote, "What's really awkward for the atheist at this point is that premise 2 is logically equivalent to the typical atheist response to Leibniz's argument. As we've just seen, the atheist typically asserts the following: if atheism is true, the universe has no explanation of its existence." End quote. And he goes on to turn that around and say, therefore, if the universe does have an explanation, then atheism is not true. Now you may be thinking, hold on a minute, when did atheists say that? But this goes back to Dr. Craig's special pleading fallacy that he was using to defend premise 1. According to Dr. Craig, some atheists say that the universe is not the product of any external cause, or in other words, that it exists because the nature of the universe is such that it exists as a physical necessity. It exists because it's impossible for there to have ever been a time when it did not exist. But because Dr. Craig is using a special pleading fallacy here, he won't allow atheists to point to that as the explanation for the universe. So he substitutes a straw man argument of saying that atheists claim the universe don't have no explanation. And it's doubly a straw man because he presents this as being a claim that must be true if an atheism is true. And that ain't a claim that atheist ever actually makes. It's entirely possible that the universe could have an unknown, non-divine explanation, even if we didn't already know that it's impossible for there to have ever been a time when it did not exist. So in no sense is it true that atheism implies an inexplicable universe. So that's strike 1 for Dr. Craig. Let's give him another swing at it. Quote, "Think of what the universe is. All of space-time reality, including all of matter and energy. It follows that if the universe has a cause of its existence, that cause must be a non-physical, immaterial being beyond space and time. Amazing." End quote. And pay particular attention to the fact that he has substituted the word cause for explanation here. The universe ain't allowed to have an explanation the way he defined explanation when he was defending premise 1. It's only allowed to have an external cause, and that's special pleading. And this cause, according to Dr. Craig, has to be an immaterial being. Why? Well, because basically that's what fits with the narrative he's trying to sell. Do immaterial beings even exist? Well, if and they did, then according to Dr. Craig, they'd have to exist outside of time and space. Or in other words, as the TMM channel likes to say, nowhere and never. Not contained in space means nowhere, and not located in time means never. So Dr. Craig would have us believe that the universe has a cause that exists nowhere and never. See, the thing about language is that you can put together words that sound like they mean something even though they don't. We can talk about something being north of the North Pole, and it sounds meaningful, but it don't mean nothing because there ain't no such thing as north of the North Pole. Or I could say, I came to a complete stop, and then I slowed down. Grammatically correct, and every word in that sentence has a well-understood meaning, but put them together and they's nonsense. Or my favorite example, more folks have been to Berlin than I have. That one sounds so reasonable it might take you a second before you go, hey, wait a minute. And that's kind of the key here. If you says something that's complete nonsense, you want to rush on ahead and distract folks with something else so they don't notice that you just spewed out gibberish. So Dr. Craig follows that with this, quote, "Now there are only two sorts of things that could fit that description, either an abstract object like a number or else an unembodied mind. But abstract objects can't cause anything. That's part of what it means to be abstract." End quote. And the problem here is that this notion of a so-called unembodied mind is an abstraction. Reality is a complex place where everything's connected and related to everything else in almost unlimited ways. So to better understand specific aspects of reality, we mentally strip away the things that's related and consider just one thing in isolation from the things it's related to. That's what abstraction means, stripping away the related details. We observe physical brains exhibiting complex behaviors in response to physical stimuli, and we want to understand that phenomenon better, so we mentally strip away all the physical details and label those complex behaviors as a mind. It's an abstraction. We're considering the notion of a mind in isolation from the physical brain and its physical stimuli so as we don't get bogged down in all the neurochemical and mechanical details of how the mind is generated. But in real life, we can't separate an actual mind from the physical brain that produces it. It's a physical process that responds to physical stimuli and other physical things like intoxicants and hallucinogens and hormones and oxygen levels and on and on and on. Even though we can talk about the mind as a conceptual abstraction, it can't actually exist apart from the physical structures and processes that produce it. And it definitely can't create universes considering it needs matter and energy and space and time in order to exist at all. It's an abstraction, and abstract stuff can't create nothing, just like Dr. Craig says. So that's strike two, and you gotta love how Dr. Craig sets himself up for his third swing. Quote, "What can the atheist do at this point? He has a more radical alternative open to him. He can retrace his steps, withdraw his objection to premise one, and say instead that yes, the universe does have an explanation of its existence." End quote. Apologists just loves to indulge in fantasies about debating atheists and watching them running around desperately trying to evade the apologists' invincible rhetoric, don't they? So what is this desperate last stand that his rhetorical brilliance has driven them poor atheists to? Quote, "But that explanation is the universe exists by a necessity of its own nature. For the atheist, the universe could serve as a sort of God substitute that exists necessarily. Now this would be a very radical step for the atheist to take, and I can't think of any contemporary atheist who has in fact adopted this line." End quote. So in other words, Dr. Craig knows that thus far he's been engaging in special pleading by refusing to allow the universe to have the same kind of explanation as he says God does. And that explains why he saved this argument for last. He wants his audience to feel like this is a desperate last-ditch attempt by the atheist to try and dodge a bullet, instead of being an obvious physics-based objection to the arguments Dr. Craig's trying to make. That's why he fantasizes about the atheist backtracking and abandoning earlier arguments and even looking for some kind of God substitute, as if subconsciously acknowledging that it takes some kind of God to create a universe. And he throws in that last line about how nobody supposedly makes this argument, kind of a reverse appeal to authority fallacy. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. So why can't the universe have an explanation by necessity of its own nature? Dr. Craig's answer is a textbook example of a composition fallacy. Quote, "As we look about the universe, none of the things that make it up, whether stars, planets, galaxies, dust, radiation, or what have you, seems to exist necessarily. They could all fail to exist. Indeed, at some point in the past when the universe was very dense, none of them did exist." End quote. In other words, the argument he's making here is that whatever's true of the parts must also be true of the whole. A cell does not have leaves, and a tree is made of cells, therefore a tree does not have leaves. And obviously that's a fallacy. The properties of the parts do not necessarily define the properties of the whole. Plus, Dr. Craig is leaving out some of the most important parts of the material universe, like the space-time continuum and the physical laws that define what we perceive as cause and effect. These things are some of the most fundamental parts of the universe, but they definitely can't have an external cause. Space-time can't have an external cause since it necessarily exists for all of time. And what we call the law of cause and effect can't have an external cause because you need a law of cause and effect in order for causes to have effects. So not only is Dr. Craig guilty of a fallacy, he's leaving out significant, relevant information. And he follows that up by a long discussion of the various subatomic particles of matter without any mention of the fact that all of matter condensed out of the energy present in the universe after the time of the Big Bang. He don't even mention energy at all, probably because he knows he can't make a valid argument against the fact that energy has always existed for all of time, and thus satisfies Leibniz's definition of an explanation by necessity of its own nature. But let's watch Dr. Craig flounder around for a bit. Quote, maybe the matter exists necessarily, and all these things are just different configurations of matter. The problem with this suggestion is that matter itself is composed of tiny fundamental particles that cannot be further broken down. Does each and every one of these particles exist necessarily? End quote. And there he goes again, assuming that whatever is true of the parts must be true of the whole as well. If the individual parts of matter don't exist necessarily, then matter as a whole don't exist necessarily. If cells don't have leaves, then trees don't have leaves neither. And just in case that one don't convince you, Dr. Craig throws something else against the wall to see if it sticks. Quote, now it seems obvious that a different collection of fundamental particles could have existed instead of the collection that does exist. But if that were the case, then a different universe would have existed. End quote. I ain't sure whether he means the various subatomic particles could have condensed out of the energy of the initial singularity in different proportions, or if he means we could have had a completely different set of subatomic particles besides quarks and bosons and such. But it's kind of irrelevant since he's completely missing the point here. Matter, in the form of matter, already has a physical cause. It condensed out of the energy present in the universe during the initial expansion. It's the energy that exists by necessity of its own nature since it has existed for all of time. And I have just a suspicion that maybe Dr. Craig knows that, and it's just possible he's waving his hand all around and making a big fuss about the technical details of particle physics in hopes that his audience's eyes will glaze over and they'll all just believe whatever he tells them because they can't keep up. But it does seem like maybe he's arguing that we could have had a completely different set of subatomic particles instead of quarks and such. Which, if he can demonstrate that with valid science, he ought to publish a peer-reviewed paper and claim his Nobel Prize. But it sounds like that because he goes on to argue that if your desk was made of ice instead of wood, it wouldn't be the same desk as your wooden one because it's made of a different material. And that leads him to conclude, quote, similarly, a universe made up of different particles, even if they were identically arranged as in this universe, would be a different universe. It follows then that the universe does not exist by a necessity of its own nature. End quote. And of course, no, that don't follow at all. He's still looking at just a part of the universe and claiming that whatever is true of one of the parts must be true of the whole. He ain't even right about the nature of the parts. He's saying that he can imagine a universe in which matter is made out of a different set of subatomic particles. But okay, I can imagine a God who's a union of 3 male persons and 3 female persons. And that'd be a different God from the Trinitarian God, so by Dr. Craig's own logic, I just proved that God don't exist by a necessity of his own nature. But the bottom line is that Dr. Craig's composition fallacy don't refute the fact that the universe does exist by a necessity of its own physical nature, so that's 3 strikes and he's out. And yet, he keeps on swinging. Quote, My claim that the universe does not exist necessarily becomes even more obvious when we reflect that it seems entirely possible that the fundamental building blocks of nature could have been substances quite different from the elementary particles we know. Such a universe would be characterized by different laws of nature. End quote. So, two things. First, different Christians has different definitions of the God they see as being the creator of the universe. Not all Christians believe in a Trinitarian God. So it ain't just that they could be different versions of this supposed creator God. There are different versions, which by Dr. Craig's logic means that none of them exist by necessity of their own nature. And secondly, just a quibble here, you sometimes hear folks talk about the laws of nature being different under different circumstances, and I think that's misleading. It ain't that the laws of physics change, it's that there's certain laws that only apply under certain circumstances. When astronomers discovered that the orbit of Mercury don't follow classic Newtonian physics, the laws of physics didn't change. It's just that relativity adds a component to the equation for gravitational attraction that's negligible until you get into the kind of space-time curvature that only exists in the immediate vicinity of the sun. The laws of physics don't change when you get near the sun. It's just that conditions close to the sun is different, and you have to take that difference into account. For our own convenience, we tend to use different versions of the equation so as we can simplify things wherever it makes sense to do so. But it's still the same physical laws everywhere. Anyways, that's pretty much it for Dr. Craig's defense of Leibniz's silly syllogism. A combination of special pleading fallacy, a fallacy of composition, and various other fallacies thrown in for extra credit. And considering Dr. Craig's 2 PhDs, I'm pretty sure he knows that these is fallacious arguments. He's only using them because he needs them to rationalize his belief in God. And like I say, Dr. Craig is a highly intelligent and highly educated individual. The fact that his religious faith reduces him to presenting obvious fallacies in defense of his claims is a strong indictment of his religious faith and the effect it has on a person's ability to use reason and logic to come to reliable conclusions. Back when I was a Bible-believing, born-again, evangelical Christian, I used to study books of apologetics looking for rational reasons to justify the things I believed in. And instead, I found this kind of stuff. It really led me to question my faith, with the result that I ended up realizing that it's all a myth. And I hope that by sharing this, I can help other folks to come to the same realization. Anyways, I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. The next chapter in Dr. Craig's book is entitled, quote, A Philosopher's Journey of Faith, Part 1. End quote. And honestly, I ain't sure yet whether or not I was going to just skip that one. Personal testimonies ain't really an apologetic, and I'm mostly here for the apologetics. But we'll see. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.